46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died.
On a freezing November night in 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished beneath Lake Superior with 29 men trapped inside. For decades, families were left with unanswered questions, and the shipwreck became a haunting legend.
Its resting place, 530 feet below the lake's surface, allowing only experienced divers with expensive submersible vehicles to visit.
But when underwater drones finally slipped through the silence, the cameras captured images no one was prepared for.
Seen pictures of the Fitzgerald, but had no idea how intact it would be. It was very sobering, beat up and buried into the mud where that ship.
What they revealed was not just wreckage. It was a frozen nightmare from the deep. The rise of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald begins with chaos and awe. On June 7, 1958, over 15,000 people gathered along the Detroit River at River Rouge, Michigan, to witness the launch of a massive brand-new freighter. She wasn't just big, she was enormous. At 729 feet long, the hull hit the water so hard that it sent a towering wave over the crowd, drenching spectators from head to toe. And before the cheers even died down, the ship struck a pier before finally settling upright. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built by Great Lakes Engineering Works and owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company.
She had been built in the late 1950s, a time of optimism on the Great Lakes.
From the very first day, it was clear she wasn't just another ore boat. She was the largest ship ever built for the Great Lakes, and everyone knew her name. Her purpose was straightforward. She carried iron ore, more specifically, taconite pellets, small, round balls made from processed iron, down from Minnesota to feed the steel mills near Detroit and Toledo.
The freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was transporting iron ore when it ran into high winds and 25-foot waves.
But it wasn't what she hauled that turned heads. It was how she looked while doing it. Her long red hull stretched across the water. Her gleaming white cabins sat sharp and clean above it, and her sleek, modern lines gave the impression of speed even when she was tied to the dock. She looked less like a slow ore boat and more like something built for speed and style. That's why she quickly earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes. At her launch, she was truly the longest vessel on the Great Lakes, and even though a Canadian ship, the 730-foot Murray Bay, took that title just a year later, the Fitzgerald's image as a giant among freighters never faded. There was something unusual about who owned her. Northwestern Mutual wasn't a shipping company at all. It was an insurance company, but they had money to invest and saw value in ships. So they owned the vessel but didn't run her themselves. Instead, they leased her under a long-term charter to Oglebay Norton's Columbia Transportation Division. That company handled her as the fleet's flagship, managing the crew, the dispatch, and the operations. It was a simple deal. Northwestern Mutual owned the asset, and the shipping professionals handled the work. That way, the Fitz could keep running non-stop without the insurance company having to bother with the day-to-day grind. And run she did. The Fitzgerald set seasonal haul records more than once and kept breaking her own numbers year after year. In 1969, she loaded a single cargo of more than 27,000 long tons, setting a record at the time. To move that much weight and still stay on schedule required serious power. Below her pilot house, a steam turbine cranked out 70,500 horsepower, enough to drive her at speeds of roughly 20 miles per hour across the inland seas. For a bulk freighter, that was flying. She was large, fast, and reliable. And on the Great Lakes, those three things meant everything. But the Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just built for work. She was built to impress. Inside, she felt less like an ore boat and more like a floating showcase. The J.L. Hudson Company, a high-end department store in Detroit, designed the interior. They laid down thick carpets, tiled the bathrooms, hung drapes over the portholes, and placed leather chairs in the lounge. There were even 2 staterooms reserved for company guests. The crew quarters were air-conditioned, which was unheard of on ore boats in the 50s. For the sailors who lived aboard her, it made all the difference. In the sweltering heat of July or the biting chill of late October, the Fitzgerald gave them comfortable bunks, cooler air, and a sense of pride that this was not just another dirty freighter. She was a good ship, and people wanted to serve on her. Over the years, she received upgrades to keep her sharp. A bow thruster was added in the late 1960s, giving her more control in tight harbors and rivers. In the early 1970s, her coal-burning boilers were converted to oil, cutting down on soot, mess, and effort for the crew. These weren't flashy changes, but they made her easier to handle and sped up her turnarounds at port. Her life followed a steady rhythm. She loaded iron ore in ports like Duluth Superior or Silver Bay, steamed down Lake Superior, passed through the Soo Locks into Lake Huron, and delivered her cargo to steel mills near Detroit or Toledo. Then she ran back light and did it all again. A round trip usually took just a few days. Loading could be done in hours, but unloading often stretched much longer. Over 17 seasons, she completed hundreds of these runs and logged more than 1 million miles under her keel. That repetition built her reputation. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just a big ship. She was reliable, and reliability mattered most. Her work also had meaning far beyond the docks. Those taconite pellets were the backbone of the steel industry. Every load she delivered went straight into blast furnaces, which produced the steel used in cars, bridges, and buildings. The Fitzgerald was more than a freighter. She was a critical link in the Midwest economy. Her cargo fueled jobs in auto plants, construction sites, and factories across the region. People loved watching her pass. At the Soo Locks, boat watchers gathered just to see her glide by. In the late 60s and early 70s, Captain Peter Pulser made her even more famous. He would play music through the ship's loudspeakers and even talk to crowds waiting on riverbanks. He turned a working ore carrier into a celebrity, a boat that felt like a moving small town. It was corny, but it made people smile, and it made them feel connected to the Queen of the Lakes. By the mid-70s, her command rested with Captain Ernest McSorley. He was a veteran with decades of service, respected by crews across the lakes. His reputation was simple: calm, professional, dependable. Sailors trusted him, and that trust mattered on ships that often faced the worst weather North America could throw at them. But no matter how strong a captain or how powerful a ship, the Great Lakes were unforgiving. Anyone who has only seen them on a calm summer day wouldn't recognize their fury in the fall. By November, the lakes became storm factories. Cold air from Canada clashed with warmer lake water. Pressure systems plunged, winds screamed, and waves piled up. Sailors called these storms November gales, or the Witch of November. Winds on Lake Superior could blow as strongly as a hurricane. The waves sometimes grew taller than 2-story houses. Because the lake is so wide, storms had plenty of open water to build up power, turning into massive, dangerous systems. For any big ship caught out there late in the season, sailing was always a risky bet. Still, the Fitzgerald felt ready for it. She was built as big as the St. Lawrence Seaway would allow, 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 39 feet deep. By the mid-1970s, sailors hoped for one more smooth run, but on November 9, 1975, Lake Superior had other plans. The last voyage of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The last day of the Edmund Fitzgerald's life began like so many others, with the confidence of a ship and crew that had done this trip countless times before.
As the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald sails toward the port of Superior, Wisconsin.
It was Sunday afternoon, November 9th, 1975. when the giant 729-foot freighter eased away from the ore docks in Superior, Wisconsin. Her steel belly was packed with more than 26,116 long tons of taconite pellets, and 29 crew members settled in for another run bound for the lower Great Lakes. Behind her, the Arthur M. Anderson, another seasoned ore carrier, followed on the same track. The Fitzgerald had the speed, so she took the lead, stretching 10 to 15 miles ahead, while both captains stayed in steady radio contact. Their plan was the northern route, a familiar line that tucked behind the Canadian shore for some shelter, threading between Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula before bending southeast toward Whitefish Point. On paper, it was a solid plan. The weather that morning didn't suggest disaster. The early forecast called for a typical November storm that would swing northeast of Lake Superior the following day. Gale warnings were issued by Sunday evening, and on the Great Lakes, that means winds in the range of 39 to 54 miles per hour. It wasn't pleasant, but it was common, and ships like the Fitzgerald were built to take it. But storms in this region have a way of sharpening their teeth. By nightfall, the forecast was upgraded to storm warnings, with sustained winds expected above 55 miles per hour. That mattered because once the storm passed and the winds swung northwest, they would blow straight across Lake Superior's longest stretch of open water. And when winds had that much room to run, the waves could rise fast, growing into walls of water.
But beyond the peaceful lakeside lies an alien world with chilling depths and sudden violent storms.
By midday on Monday, November 10th, both ships had passed the top of Lake Superior and were heading southeast toward Whitefish Bay. The Anderson played it safe, steering a little farther west to stay clear of the dangerous shore near Michipicoten Island. The Fitzgerald, still leading, stuck to her southeast course. That afternoon, logs showed the two captains trading updates as the storm grew worse. The sky darkened, and snow squalls cut visibility down to almost nothing. The first real sign of trouble came at about 3:30 in the afternoon. Captain Ernest McSorley of the Fitzgerald called back to the Anderson with a report. A fence rail was down, 2 vents were either gone or damaged, and the ship was listing. A list means the vessel was leaning to one side, which can happen if water collects in the wrong place, if cargo shifts, or even if the wind pins her down. 1. McSorley said he was slowing down so the Anderson could close the gap. When the Anderson's captain asked if the pumps were running, McSorley confirmed both were. The exchange was plain but telling. 2 experienced captains in a blow don't waste words.
McSorley has spent 44 seasons on the water, working his way up from deckhand to ship's master.
They talk damage, pumps, and pace. Practical language that boils down to one question. Is the ship keeping ahead of the water? Just after 4 o'clock, the stakes rose higher. McSorley radioed again. Both navigation radars were out. In good weather, that would be annoying. But in heavy snow, spray, and with night closing in, it was deadly. Radar was the tool that let captains track shorelines and other ships when the eye couldn't see past the bow. Without it, the Fitzgerald was blind. McSorley asked the Anderson to guide him all the way to Whitefish Bay. From that point forward, the escort would be his eyes. A few minutes later, around 4:39, another blow landed. The Fitzgerald couldn't pick up the Whitefish Point radio beacon, a shore transmitter that ships use to line up the bay entrance. The Coast Guard station at Grand Marais confirmed the beacon was down. 2 layers of safety, radar, and beacon were gone. Between 5 and 5:30, Captain McSorley radioed the Swedish freighter Avafors to ask about navigation aids. The Avafors confirmed the Whitefish Point lighthouse was lit, but the radio beacon was still down. In the background of that call, the Avafors pilot overheard someone on the Fitzgerald's bridge say, "Don't allow nobody on deck," followed by something about a damaged vent. McSorley himself then came on, reporting a heavy list, both radars dead, and waves crashing over the deck, seas he called some of the worst he had ever faced. Darkness was falling, snow squalls came and went, and the Fitzgerald was now completely blind, relying only on the Andersons' directions. By then, Lake Superior was unleashing its full force.
Yet not strong enough to endure the fierce November gales of Lake Superior, a waterway that became a graveyard.
The Andersons' logs, and later studies, show winds blowing steadily in the upper 50s with even stronger gusts. The average height of the biggest waves was in the mid-20s, meaning some giants may have been nearly twice that size. Put simply, both ships were facing constant 20 to 25-foot waves, with the occasional monster towering far higher. Seas that buried bows, ripped equipment loose, and tested every seam of steel in the hull. By late afternoon, the pair was closing on whitefish from different lanes. At 5:20, the Anderson recorded a wave smashing her starboard lifeboat, a blunt reminder that even the escort was under siege. Winds were clocked at 67 miles per hour out of the northwest, with gusts higher still. Seas were in the 18 to 25-foot range and still building. Both captains were balancing a brutal choice: stay out in deeper water to avoid breaking seas near shore, or push harder for the lee of Whitefish Bay. By early evening, the Andersons' crew was basically guiding the Fitzgerald through the storm. They kept giving her bearings and distances, drawing a radar map she couldn't make for herself. Around 5:30, the Anderson radioed they were east of Caribou Island, and Whitefish Point was 35 miles ahead. McSorley replied that he planned to pass 2.5 miles off the point, a normal move in rough weather to stay safe. The Andersons' radar showed the Fitzgerald drifting slightly left, but still matching McSorley's reported heading. It didn't sound dramatic, but it showed just how much the Fitzgerald now depended on her escort. As 7 o'clock approached, Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, kept a steady eye on the Fitzgerald's radar blip. Snow squalls made it fade in and out, sometimes lost in the sea clutter. Around 7:10, the Anderson asked McSorley how he was holding up. His answer was short and calm: "We are holding our own." Those were the last words anyone ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Just 10 minutes later, at 7:20, the Fitzgerald's blip disappeared from the radar. The squall cleared, visibility opened up, and the Anderson could see shore lights 20 miles away and another ship 19 miles ahead. But the Fitzgerald, supposed to be just 10 miles in front, was gone. No lights, no radio call, nothing. The Anderson kept calling, but silence was the only reply. In that silence, the fate of 29 men was sealed.
The ship and its 29-man crew vanished in a storm with 80-mile-an-hour winds and wave heights up to 25 feet.
At 8:32, after many failed attempts to reach her and the Coast Guard, the Anderson finally reported that the Fitzgerald may have suffered a casualty. It was a restrained way of admitting the obvious: she had vanished. From then on, it wasn't about navigation anymore. It was about search. The Coast Guard pulled together whatever ships and aircraft they could in the storm. Around 9 o'clock, the Anderson was asked to turn back to look for survivors. She had already reached safer water in Whitefish Bay, and turning around meant diving back into the fury of the lake. But her crew agreed and went back. The William Clay Ford, another freighter, also left shelter to join the search. Planes and a helicopter fought their way into the sky. Back out in the storm, the Anderson's crew spotted broken lifeboats and debris, but no signs of life. No flares, no signals, just wreckage. The search continued, but not a single body from the 29 crew members was ever recovered.
An air and sea search is continuing for possible survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier.
Coast Guard cutters came from distant ports. Aircraft swept the lake, and other ships joined in. As the storm slowly eased, more debris appeared. Rafts, twisted wreckage, but not a single body. That silence told its own story. If no one had even launched a lifeboat, then the ship must have gone down suddenly, with no time to react. Families on both sides of the border clung to hope. But after 3 days of searching, hope was fading. On November 14th, 4 days after the Fitzgerald vanished, a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion plane equipped with a magnetic detector, gear meant to sense large metal objects underwater, found a strong signal 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point. Over the next 3 days, the Coast Guard cutter Wood Rush dragged side-scan sonar across the spot. The images showed two huge shapes lying close together on the lake bottom, 530 feet down. The position matched exactly where the Anderson had last tracked the Fitzgerald. The search for survivors was officially over, and that's where the questions began. The timeline was clear. The ending was clear. But why the Edmund Fitzgerald went down that night has remained a debate for nearly 50 years, between data, theories, and what the cameras on the lakebed later revealed. The mystery of what really broke the Fitzgerald. If you want to get to the truth, you have to look at three things: what the official investigations concluded, what sailors themselves argued, and what the cameras on the bottom eventually revealed. The first full investigation came from the Coast Guard's Marine Board, which released its report in 1977. They concluded that the ship probably flooded through hatch covers that weren't completely weather-tight. Once water made it past those steel lids, the design of the ship gave it room to spread unchecked. There were no flooding alarms to warn the crew, and there were no solid watertight walls dividing the long cargo hold from end to end. Instead, the space inside was basically one giant open bay with only screens, so once water got in, it could run a long way. The board made a point that matters. When they said weather-tight, they weren't using a fancy technical term. They meant exactly this: a hatch cover should stop waves washing over the deck from leaking inside. On paper, the Fitzgerald had a system designed for that: a steel lid for each hatch, a rubber gasket underneath, and dozens of hand-cranked clamps called Kestner clamps to pull it tight.
Each clamp must be tightened manually. Each hold sealed, watertight.
But the Coast Guard explained why that was easier said than done. You had to dog down every one of those clamps, on every hatch, every trip, and keep the seals in good shape. That's a lot to maintain in pounding seas. In 1978, the National Transportation Safety Board released its own findings. Their bottom line was almost the same.
Coast Guard had a very, very extensive investigation. They couldn't even draw any real concrete conclusions.
The ship likely sank because of sudden, massive flooding of the cargo hold due to the collapse of one or more hatch covers. They also flagged two factors that made the storm worse. First, the absence of watertight bulkheads inside the cargo space meant water could move freely once it entered. Second, shipping rules had changed over the years, allowing freighters to ride lower in the water. That reduced freeboard meant the deck was closer to the waves, so more water washed across it. And when a ship leans to one side, the water stays on deck longer and pounds harder against the hatch lids. The numbers back this up, and they're not guesses. Each hatch cover had 68 clamps.
And half an hour to seal each hatch with a 7-ton sheet of steel rimmed with 68 clamps.
And the engineering math shows that each one needed to pull with about 2,400 pounds of force to properly seal the gasket. The cover itself weighed 14,000 pounds, but its weight alone wasn't nearly enough to hold out heavy seas. To be secure, a hatch needed roughly 178,000 pounds of total clamping force. That's how much pressure those clamps had to create. And then there's the cargo itself. Taconite pellets can soak up 4 to 7% of their weight in water. For a load of 26,116 tons, that means between 1,000 and 1,700 tons of water could be hidden in the cargo without anyone seeing puddles or free water sloshing around. What about proof from the wreck itself? In May of 1976, the Navy sent its CURV-3 robot down to take photos. The images showed the bow lying upright, the stern upside down, and about 200 feet of the middle section missing, scattered as debris. On the bow, hatch cover number 1 had fallen inside and was buckled from the force pressing down on it. Hatch number 2's cover was completely gone, with the coaming bent and broken. Hatch number 3's cover was partly visible, buried in mud, and hatch number 5's cover was missing entirely. Along hatch 5's coaming, investigators could still see a line of 16 clamps. 14 were unbroken but sitting open, and 2 were bent or broken. That meant those clamps weren't actually pulling the lid down when the ship hit bottom. A Wormswurf bent near hatch 5 had also been ripped away, leaving an open hole on deck. These photos are critical. They don't tell the whole story on their own, but they give clues. A missing hatch lid could have been lost during the storm, or it could have torn free when the ship broke apart. Open clamps that were still undamaged mean those clamps were not engaged when the ship settled on the bottom. Either they weren't tightened before the storm, or they were forced open when the cover was torn off. The torn vent is exactly the kind of storm damage that can funnel water inside. Taken together, the images don't prove every detail, but they strongly support the idea that water forced its way in through the top. Not everyone agreed. Many sailors and even some company officials pushed a different explanation: grounding. Their theory pointed to a shallow spot called 6 Fathom Shoal, north of Caribou Island.
Bridge that the Fitzgerald was much too close to 6 Fathom Shoal for his comfort. This shoal, located just north of Caribou Island.
They argued that with the Whitefish Point radio beacon out that night, and with visibility collapsing in snow, the Fitzgerald may have strayed too close, scraped bottom, and sustained damage below the waterline. This theory gained weight because after the wreck, Canadian surveyors found that the shoal actually extended about a mile farther east than old charts showed. And officers on the Anderson believed the Fitzgerald had passed through the danger zone. But when the NTSB compared this idea against all the evidence, they disagreed. Their track reconstructions showed the Fitzgerald was about 3 miles clear of the shoal when she vanished. And the stern, which lies upside down, didn't show the fresh gouges or scrapes you'd expect from a recent grounding. Divers who inspected the shoal afterward also found no signs of a fresh hit. So while grounding wasn't declared impossible, the best evidence didn't support it as the cause. Another theory was that the ship may have snapped in two while still on the surface, a failure sailors call hogging or sagging, depending on whether the middle is lifted by a wave or dropped into a trough. It wasn't out of the question. 2 other Great Lakes freighters, the Carl D. Bradley and the Daniel J. Morrell, had broken apart in storms years earlier. But when investigators ran the numbers, they found the stresses on the Fitzgerald in the known conditions were still below the breaking point. They pointed to how close the bow and stern landed on the lake bed as evidence that the ship likely went down intact, then broke either during the descent or when it struck bottom. Over the years, newer computer models have tried to replay the night with more precision. Naval architects used digital hull models, cargo weights, and storm data to simulate what might have happened. Some of those studies showed how small problems can cascade into disaster. For example, storm damage reduces freeboard, water stays on deck longer, clamps already under strain don't hold, one hatch lid fails, water pours in, and the ship suddenly can't recover. The waves themselves deserve attention. On the eastern side of Superior that night, the northwest wind had a long, clean run across open water. That's why the waves grew so huge. Hindcast studies show average wave heights in the mid-20s, with some rare peaks reaching into the 30s and even 40s. The Anderson's captain later described taking 2 30 to 35-foot waves that smashed one of his lifeboats and buried his bridge. Sailors on the lakes know this pattern as the Three Sisters, 3 oversized waves in quick succession. The first buries the deck, the second hits before the water can drain, and the third piles even more on top. If a ship is already leaning and riding low, that sequence can overload hatch covers in seconds. The truth is that no single flaw or single wave brought her down, but a chain of weaknesses that all came together on the wrong night. Thanks for watching. Now, check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.